Well, hello and welcome to Talk Time. Now, this week we're going to be talking about nation building and we're going to be talking about national development. What are the problems? How far have we come? Where are we likely to go? And so on. So, welcome to Talk Time. Hello and welcome back to Talk Time. And as I indicated from the beginning, we're going to be talking about nation building and we're going to be talking about national development planning. Where are we coming from? Where are we now? And where are we likely to go? And what better person to have in the studio than Dr. Nii Moi Thompson, who used to be the Director General of the National Development Planning Commission. Sir, you're welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pratt.
What is nation building? And when we're talking about nation building, what are we talking about, sir?
Thanks very much. I think you summarized it pretty well. One of your phrases was, where are we coming from? That's what nation building is all about, actually, before we even talk about national development. Nation building is basically forging a group of people, typically of different backgrounds, different histories, together as a nation before you even begin to talk about developing them. If you don't get that first requirement there, where you have a unit of people of different backgrounds, then national development becomes a big challenge. And this is one of the biggest problems actually that Nkrumah faced. People often ignore that Nkrumah was operating on two levels. One, trying to hold together what was the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, so that they didn't break up, and at the same time try and meet our material needs. This means that all these groups or tribes or whatever you want to call them that were once fighting, now we're bound together in a common border. How do we get along? And that's very critical. You may remember that he even went as far as passing the Avoidance of Discrimination Act to prevent the establishment or maintenance of political parties based on tribe, religion. So the Gashifimokbe, the Muslim Association Party, they were all gone. This was all part of nation building, both as a foundation for national development. I think we've come a long way in terms of viewing ourselves as one, forgetting our past differences. But of course, lately we've had all sorts of issues where some people may feel alienated or feel less Ghanaian because of certain things and all that. And that, to me, it's a threat to national development. And it's something that we really need to address or confront in a serious way before we even discuss national. Otherwise, everything else will ultimately fall apart.
But those threats are real. I mean, even the creation of new regions is based on the assumption that some parts of the country were disadvantaged in the distribution of resources and so on. Now we have the Western Togolanders, the issue with Western Togolanders, the so-called apparent conflict between some ethnic Akan groups and so on. What is your assessment?
Well, it shows that we haven't quite completed, and I don't think we would ever complete, but we haven't quite finished or maybe fully appreciated the importance of nation building. And this is where the utterances of public officials are very critical. In some countries, they even have laws where if a public official makes a statement that's felt to threaten nationhood, nation building, they are censured, fired, or even tried. But we don't have that, and so we tend to take so much for granted. And then two examples come to mind. One was the Minister for Housing, Works and Housing, Atachia, recently when he was on television, saying that if you take the history of his people out, the rest of Ghana has no history. The most egregious, the most offensive statement that a public official could make. And yet he made that and got away with it. There was the comment by K.T. Hammond, K. Tahir Hammond, about, what's the name, plebiscite, 1956, and trying to create a sense of alienation among people who have been an integral part of Ghana since the beginning. And these are the kinds of things that we want to watch against. Yes, there's this feeling that certain parts of the country are less developed and so forth and so on. That unfortunately has been with us for a substantial part of time. But if we pay attention, if we begin to create or aggravate that, we are actually making it difficult for us to solve the problem. So a typical example is what happened with, let's say, the creation of the OT region. Long before that creation, there was already a plan. People often think of SADA in terms of ACOMFEM and all that, but they forget that the last 2 years of SADA were actually very productive, and there's a very good plan for actually developing that, because the northern part of Volta was part of the SADA region. So there were already plans there. That's one. Two, we need to understand that districts, not regions, are the fundamental elements of development. So you can create all the regions you want. If the districts are still not empowered, there will still be lack of development. So we need to understand all these things before we make decisions. But if we pander to ethnic sentiments, they may be an end in themselves without necessarily bringing material benefit to the people. So we need to watch all these things. Unfortunately, we don't have the kind of checks and balances that we should have in our political system, where the president, more or less railroads pretty much everything through the legislature and gets its way. So that is very critical, and we need to do that. The second one has to do with the Togoland issue. That, of course, it's been there. It was there during Nkrumah's time. And when you read Nkrumah's biography, he does discuss that. And then he reminds us of the colonial legacy, the colonial basis of that. In fact, in his biography, he presents a graph of Ghana. And then that's a section of it where he talks about the Ewe, those who are already part of the Gold Coast, and those who came on the British Togoland. And on the left side of it, it's a map of Nzimaland, where the colonialists simply drew a line through it. So you have Nzimas in Ghana and the Nzimas in it. And he said these are the kinds of issues that we have to deal with. So we need to approach them very, very carefully. If you don't do that and you begin to agitate, then the nation states that we need to build as a basis for continental unity itself is threatened. So again, we need to be mindful, especially those of us in the public space, and definitely public officials should be very mindful in the kinds of pronouncements they make, so that they do not alienate sections of the population. We all came from somewhere. No Ghanaian's ancestor grew from the ground here. Everybody's ancestor came at some point or the other. So it's foolish, really, to create the impression that someone came late because of a plebiscite and therefore they are less of a Ghanaian. No.
Would you accept that the creation of new regions would necessarily bring development to those parts of the country?
No. As I stated earlier, there were obviously some simmering issues about who has allegiance to who, which tribal group, where, and so forth and so on. But in addressing those simmering issues, we shouldn't confuse ourselves with the notion that somehow regions will lead to development. As I said, it is districts. So you can have all the regions you want. Sometimes people say, well, all the development is in Accra. Frankly, if you take away a few fancy buildings in Accra, it's like the rest of the country. Nothing really is happening in Accra. Accra is a sprawling slum with a few nice buildings here and there. I recently drove to Ablekuma. The road was so bad. I mean, my body was shaking all over the place that my watch, I have a Samsung smartwatch, which monitors my body movement and tells me what I'm... And I actually thought, because I was sitting down and shaking, I was riding a bicycle. So the show, the icon came on as a bike and started congratulating me for doing a bicycle exercise until I got on the smooth road, and then it went off. That's just how, and this is Accra. So we have a big problem of underdevelopment nationally. There may be a few signs of here and there, but it's a big national problem. And it will not be solved until we recognize that development ultimately is a community issue. So local communities, local economic development. Unfortunately, if you look at the track record, especially in recent times, the central government has tended to not only concentrate development, or at least resources, not necessarily development. The resources tend to be concentrated in Accra at the expense of local communities. And even Accra doesn't really develop anything. So monies that should go to the district assemblies through the DACF are actually spent in Accra, sometimes through very dubious contracts that let every district assembly. There was a time when every district assembly was required to buy a grader, even though they didn't need a grader. Sometimes it's a school building with roof problems, but it's to spend your money on a grader. And there's a procurement mafia in Accra that actually lives at the expense of these communities. These are the issues that we need to address. And in fact, when we were discussing not long ago, when there was talk of local elections, I was actually in the field doing some research in Cape Coast and Aguno. And you could see the feeling that, hey, give us the opportunity to choose our own people, for us to set our own priorities, as opposed to the national government interfering in all these. So ultimately, development is a local issue, and we need to provide the space and the resources for local communities. Once they develop and you aggregate them, then of course you have national development. Yes.
But there's been so much talk about decentralization.
Yes.
How come that we have this situation?
There are different aspects of decentralization. There's supposed to be the fiscal side, where the local governments have control over finances, but there's also something they call intergovernmental transfers, where the central government is supposed to transfer certain monies to them. And in Ghana, it's even more serious, because the only major source of revenue for local governments in Ghana are typically the markets, the lorry parks. Those provide regular revenue for them. And then we have what we call one-off sources of revenue, which is estate taxes, real estate taxes. That's what. So there isn't much money really for local economic developments to develop. In some other jurisdictions, local governments do get a portion of consumer taxes. It goes directly to them. In Ghana, the government collects the VAT and everything that's supposed to, part of it, that's supposed to go to the local governments. It collects the VAT and brings it to Accra and puts it in a DACF, with understanding that it will go back to the communities. Very little of it goes. And when it does, it's actually very late. So consistently, the local governments and local communities are deprived of the resources that they need for development. And the national government needs to be made aware that it comes back to haunt them. In the case of Cape Coast, when I was there, I kept saying that, listen, you look at the Ridge Hotel there. If the Ridge Hotel does well, it means the local economies do well. And of course, the central government also benefits from corporate profit taxes, income taxes, VAT and other. But they don't do that. So this is a discussion that we need to have to constantly make it aware, or make it clear to national policymakers that your interest ultimately lies in communities all around the country, and not just in Accra. And the monies that you extract from the local communities should go back for their development. Don't come and spend them on a bunch of cars and fancy houses and so. So there is this, shall we say, for lack of a better term, kind of replication of colonialism, really, where the center is simply taken from the communities and not really putting much back in there. It's a big problem. It's a big problem.
Well, viewers, we are talking to Dr. Nii Moi Thompson, former Director General of the National Development Planning Commission. And we are talking about nation building, and we are talking about our development efforts. We're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we're going to pay a little more attention to development and what Dr. Nii Moi Thompson and others try to do in the long-term National Development Plan. Short break. Hello and welcome back to Talk Time. We are talking to Dr. Nii Moi Thompson, former Director General of the National Development Planning Commission. Now, sir, when we talk about development, what exactly are we talking about? What is development? Mm-hmm. Building of structures? What is it?
Yes. The development in its most basic form is simply improving the living standards of the people. And there are different ways of measuring that. One is literacy, because it's believed that if you can read and write and at least do some basic computations, you understand issues around you. It's often given an example of someone who cannot read and sitting in a building that says danger, keep away. They don't know they're there. They could easily. So literacy, education generally, and at the beginning of the independence period, these are some of the things we aspire to. Of course, good health services. Employment over time has become a central feature of it because it's assumed that if you are employed and you have decent work, because it's one thing to be employed, you could be the working poor. We don't want that. We want employment that pays you well so that you can, at the very minimum, afford some of the most basic things in life. So we have key indicators: education, health, decent work, housing, affordable public transportation. All these things are evidence of or manifestations of development. But in order for us to do that, we also need to be mindful, and this is what has been the challenge for us since independence. The Ghana, or for that matter, any post-colonial economy, was not designed to develop itself. It was designed to be exploited for the development of others. And therefore, we need different strategies, different approaches to our own development to raise the living standards of our people. One of them is to be very efficient in the limited resources that we have. Because unlike Britain, which had colonies, and it could easily go to those colonies and take monies from there to come and fill its coffers, we don't have that. In fact, after the Second World War, Britain was so broke, people don't realize it. The British themselves don't realize that. They were so broke that the Gold Coast gave them 200 million pounds just so they could survive. But we don't have that option. Today, if we need 200 million pounds, we have to go begging from them. So we need to have a more efficient approach. In other words, have a productivity revolution alongside the various policies that we pursue. Unfortunately, we haven't been successful in doing that, and therefore it has led to kind of stagnation in development. Yes, we have some literacy or education systems in place, but sometimes they've actually declined in quality. The same with health and so forth and so on. So those are the challenges. We know the key features of development, but working to strengthen them and enhance them has remained our biggest challenges. And to a large extent, it can be resolved through efficient institutions, through improvement in governance. I've just established the relationship between local government and national government. Those things will actually help us to attain the levels of development that we want. There are other high-level targets also, such as per capita income. It gives you a sense. It doesn't by itself tell you that you are developed, but over time we do know that there's a close relationship between a nation's per capita income and its level of development, because higher per capita income means that you have a higher potential, financial potential, to finance your education, health, infrastructure, and so forth and so on.
But sir, you are given a huge opportunity to change the development paradigm when you were appointed Director General of the National Development Planning Commission.
Yes.
What happened? First of all, what did you find when you got there, and what happened during your tenure?
Well, we found a commission that had been starved to a large extent of resources, but we managed to fill that gap. And we didn't really make much noise about that, in the sense that we looked within. We decided not to turn to donors for us to prepare a plan. So Professor Botwe, who was the chairman then, and I was the Director General, together we managed to mobilize resources to develop a plan. Now the plan, which is eventually became the 40-year, that's the name people gave it, 40-year development plan. And it became 40 years by coincidence, because between 2018 and 2057, when Ghana will be celebrating its 100th anniversary, it just happened to be 40 years. So we adapted that on our 100th anniversary, we must be able to leave something worthwhile for our children. And then the 40 years was then broken into 10 4-year plans. And those 10-year, 4-year plans also coincide with 10 election cycles. So the first election cycle was supposed to be this year. And then the 10th election will be 2056. So whoever wins that would have taken us into 2057. So we set high-level targets. Now, we were mindful that no one even knows what's going to happen tomorrow. How much more 40 years in? But that gives you a guide. It's not an absolute guide. A critical, and I brought a copy, I don't know if your camera can catch that.
Yes.
Yes. A critical element.
The camera should catch that.
It should, okay. A critical element of that is I'll show you in a second, the demographics. There's a section there called demographics. If you can see that, it's here. So demographics is population. So 2016, it was 28.9 million. And then by 2018, now we projected our population for 2057 to be 57.28 million. That's a projection. That's only 2057. The United Nations has population projections of over 100 years. So they are fairly easy to project. Why is population critical? Because once you have a sense of your population levels and the population growth rate, it helps you to determine so many things. The number of schools you should build, the number of teachers you should train, the number of medical doctors, nurses, just about even sanitation, water. We do know that with the calculation is the amount of water per capita consumed. So if you know the number of people you have in 2057, you start preparing now so that you don't have a situation as we have now where there's water here, there's no water there and so forth. So that's what we did. But people thought, well, we don't need. In fact, the Minister of State for Planning, Professor Jambafo, who was appointed by Nana Akufo-Addo, actually went to Parliament and declared that long-term planning is needless. Those were his exact words. And let me just share with you something here from the 7-year development plan of Kwame Nkrumah. Now, the 7-year development plan was originally 5 years, but it was raised to 7 to coincide with 1970. So there will be the 10th anniversary of a republic in Ghana. But this is what it says about the importance of long-term planning. It says, the economic policies to be realized under this and successive plans of economic development will lack direction and consistency unless they are firmly related to a clear vision of the structure of the economy towards which we are moving. Besides, it is only in the longer view that it is rational to project any real radical transformation of our economic system. And then it adds, in the very short period, we remain prisoners of our past. In the very short period, we remain prisoners of our past. And to a large extent, we have remained prisoners of our past. Today we say, oh, we're exporting cocoa, we're exporting oil, we're exporting gold. But if you do a careful analysis, you realize that nobody really knows what happens to the gold money anyway, even though it's the largest, quote-unquote, real foreign exchange earner. But most of the money doesn't come to us. So it's just on paper that it is the largest foreign exchange earner. You go to oil, the same thing. Nobody really knows what happens to most of the money. The only crop or the only source of foreign exchange that continues to hold this country is cocoa. Because almost everything. So we still remain prisoners of our past. Because we haven't taken that long-term. If someone had taken that long-term only 40 years ago, we wouldn't be in the mess that we are today. It's the same thing. People are saying, well, Okada legalization. If someone had a vision of transportation 40 years ago, we wouldn't be discussing Okada. So the issue of having a long-term plan is not so rigid that it prevents political parties from developing their own money. Not at all. So in this one, for instance, look at page 5. I think I've given you a copy. Page 5, we have at the top there, basic schools with drinking water, basic schools with toilets. If you look at the top, number 3, basic schools with toilet, public schools was only 60%. 60%. We said that by 2021, which is next year, every school should have a toilet. So that it depends on the political party and how it will approach it. The target has already been set at the national level. The basic schools have only 60. Does it even make sense? It's so inhumane that you build schools for children and you decide that, no, we'll give toilet to some of them, but not the others. Meanwhile, no public official in this country would send their child to a school without toilet. So why are we sending other people's children to schools without toilets? It's simply inhumane. We have basic schools with drinking water. Some schools don't have. Some of us, of course, went to schools like that. But that's way back. We shouldn't inflict that same hardship on children of today. And so we set the targets. And so it's up to each political party to say, wait a second. The plan says that by 2021, no school should go without toilets. What are we going to put in our manifesto to move towards that higher level? The plan says that by 2057, we should have about $58,000 in per capita income instead of what are we going? So they were complementary. Another advantage of it, in terms of, besides helping political parties to develop their manifesto, is that it will also give Ghanaians a framework for monitoring the performance of government. It's not the government that's going to rate itself and say, well, we think we'll give ourselves 80%. No, Ghanaians will easily go through that and see that. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked the way it should. And so we see a lot of the mistakes of the past still being repeated. And for those of us who worked on the plan, it's a very painful thing. But then, such are the times. People have accepted. Since the two major political parties came out with their manifestos, I received a lot of inquiries from people saying, "Nii, don't you think this is a time for us to have a common national development agenda?" Yes, and I say yes. Maybe with the passage of time, Ghanaians will come to terms with that and realize that we need a common roadmap to guide all of us. And then the drivers may change now and then. But we all know that it's a common roadmap that's guiding all of us to a particular destination.
It has been said that one of the hindrances to serious development is the reliance on export of primary commodities. Yes. Is that true? And if that is true, how may we get out of this quagmire?
It is true, and this was found even before we became independent thereabout, that there's something they call secular decline in the prices of primary commodities. In other words, over time, they decline in value, as opposed to the prices of manufacturers. Over time, they go up. So if you rely primarily on primary commodities for your development, over time, you're going to find it very difficult to even meet your basic expenditures and whatnot. And that's why right after independence, we started with industrialization. But industrialization, unfortunately, also depended to a large extent on the money we got from agriculture. That's why when cocoa prices collapsed in 1965, the 7-year development plan started having challenges. But nevertheless, we've learned from that. And Nkrumah at least put in the key foundational characteristics and so forth. Unfortunately, we did not build on that. And we have deviated since then. Even now, as everyone keeps talking about transformation of the economy, the language remains the same. You read the budget that's presented to Parliament. It's always about, Mr. Speaker, the price of cocoa, the price of oil. When we prepared the plan, we created a category, a special category for exports called the strategic exports. These were going to be high value products and services that will help us move away from the reliance on primary commodities and help us raise the necessary resources that we've done. Unfortunately, no one picked that up. And so the discussion and the thinking and mindset is still around primary commodities. Someone was just telling me, I knew that in 1962, Ghana was ahead of South Korea, for example. But I didn't know that the head of state of South Korea, Park Chung-hee, actually came here in 1964 with his little girl to come and study Ghana's development plan. So they were behind, and we tend to play down how prominent Ghana was back then. He came here with his daughter, who later became president of South Korea. She was the one who actually told the story to a Ghanaian. That listen, I have an album here of me and my father visiting your country in 1964 to see how we. And of course, they came and picked up all the tricks. Start by producing consumer goods, and then you graduate to heavy equipment and so forth and so on, then exports. That's exactly. So we had the framework. They overthrew Nkrumah. Everything Nkrumah was thrown out. We started all over again, and here they are. Today they give us foreign aid.
Well, viewers, we are talking to Dr. Nii Moi Thompson, former Director General of the National Development Planning Commission, and we are talking about nation building, and we are talking about concepts of development and development on the ground, practically. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'd like us to go into an area where there's no complete national agreement on, which is quite controversial. And we're going to be talking about the state of the national economy and how that impinges on our development effort. Short break. Well, hello and welcome back to Talk Time. We are talking to Dr. Nii Moi Thompson, former Director General of the National Development Planning Commission, and we're talking about so many things. Now, sir, what in your view is the state of the national economy?
Well, we were obviously adversely affected by COVID. So, and it's not just Ghana, it's a global thing. But even before COVID, if you read the government's budget for 2020, they were projecting a decline in economic growth rate from around 8.1 in 2017 to around 4.6 or so in 2022. So clearly, the economy was already on a declining trajectory before the COVID crisis hit, and it only aggravated things. It appears that the central bank has gone out of its way to pump a lot of money into the economy to help keep it afloat. And that was the practice the world over. All central banks simply printed more money to help the economy stay afloat. Otherwise, it would have ground to a halt. The question now is how efficient we've been in spending that money to cope with the COVID crisis. Unfortunately, no one can answer that because we haven't done the kind of audit that we need. In some countries, they've actually had COVID audits to make sure that the money was spent properly. In our case, when the idea was floated, the man who should have or who would have done the audit was chased out of town. And so we still don't know whether or not the money has been well spent or it will just float through the system. I heard the president say that the economy is rebounding. We will wait for the next GDP figures for us to make a sound decision on that. But even then, we'll still have to know exactly what parts of the country are benefiting from any revival and what parts of the country are not. Again, this takes us back to local economic development and for us to do all those things. So yes, we are emerging from that. The COVID crisis definitely took everyone by surprise, but it also provides opportunities for us to do things differently. The digital economy was there. That means that we need to sit on the telcos for them to not just provide reliable services, but also make their tariffs more affordable. We have some of the highest tariffs in the world with some of the poorest services and so forth. So this is an opportunity for us to realign the economy and do things differently. We also need to, again, revisit the issue of the size of government. Personally, I think that we need a law to restrain the president's ability to form new ministries and so forth. In Liberia, it's like that. The president cannot just form a ministry. You have to go to parliament, provide a justification and so forth. I think that we place too much stress on the government budget by the needless. There's only one new ministry that we need, which is a ministry for public sector reform and innovation to keep all ministries going. But the government as it is now is certainly not capable of delivering development the way we do. There's too much inefficiency in there. Too much.
There's been so much talk about the country's debt levels. Mm-hmm. What is the reality? And how is that reality related to our development efforts?
That's a very good question. There's always been this issue about debt GDP ratio and all that. It doesn't always make sense in the case of a developing country like Ghana, because debt GDP levels are a function of so many things. It depends on how well your economy is growing, the interest rates and so forth and so on. So Japan, for instance, long before the COVID, had a debt GDP ratio of over 230, for example, while we were scared to even get to 60. And that's because in our case, we can get up at any time and rebase the GDP, and then the ratio goes down because the GDP is at the bottom and so forth. What we should be really focused on is our debt service, how much we actually pay to service our debt as a share of our revenue. Because that really tells you your ability to service your debt. The debt GDP ratio is your capacity or your potential, which is really not the best measure. But your ability to service your debt is far more important. Now, what then determines your ability? It's based on how you spend the money that you borrowed. But unfortunately for us, there's been so much secrecy and inefficiency in the way we contract debt that the general conclusion is that it's massively misused and underutilized. Another problem is that as I speak with you, we do not have what we call capital budgeting. Capital budgeting is a very efficient way of identifying all the projects, costing them and so forth and so on, and then borrowing to finance them. Currently, we don't have that. We stopped doing that in 1999. So what happens, especially with respect to foreign debt, you have foreign banks and foreign institutions, financial institutions, that then go around and saying, they may tell one of their agents, go to Africa. This year, we want $200 million from Africa. And then they'll go around and say, okay, let's start with Ghana with 20 million. Let's go and sell some project to Ghana, get an agent in Ghana and say, listen, work with your ministers and whatnot, we give you a certain percentage so that you take a loan of $20 million from us to do. So over and over again, we sit here and they impose these projects on us because there's no framework. And so they wait until the last moment when Parliament is about to rise, they then give them these contracts. Less than 15 minutes they have to sign. And before we know it, we have a debt that we weren't even thinking of. But someone saw a business opportunity to meet their targets in Europe or wherever. And it's actually quite serious. When I was in office, I remember in 2015 when we were having challenges with the debt situation and the IMF was likely to come in, we went to a certain European country. And believe me, some of us, the public officials, had to hide in our hotel rooms because their government officials were so determined to get us to sponsor debt, more debt, just so they could give the money to their businesses. But we don't think at that high level. And usually when they do that, it's okay, we'll give you 20 million, but 2 million will be a grant. We need to be smart. It's a grant just to entice you. The grant that's supposed to be free money, it means after they give you the loan, they then have to use the money to buy all the things that they... So if this thing costs $5, because they give you the loan, they'll charge you $20. So in theory, it's a grant, but you are paying for the grant by overpaying for this thing here. The Jubilee House, the same thing. We went to India for money for rural electrification for 30 million. Afterwards, just casually, someone asked for another 30 million to go and renovate our former president's house. The Indians readily saw a business opportunity and said, okay, let's agree and lock these Africans in, and then we can begin to escalate the thing. And that's what they did. So we took on the debt, they came in, and then it started escalating. Before they were done, it was close to more than 100 million US dollars. Even the sockets that they installed were Indian sockets. They weren't Ghanaian sockets. So whenever you moved into an office of Flash, Jubilee House, whatever they call it, you had to then replace it with the Ghanaian socket. That's just how insidious it is. So we need to be clear-eyed and clear-headed as to what kind of debt is good for development and what kind of debt is simply bad but good for businesses out there. And one way of doing that is to go back to the practice of having capital budgeting. So from the get-go, you know, maybe they'll come in and go through the capital budget and say, okay, we'll finance this, we'll finance. That we know because that has been established as a priority. But as long as there's no such thing, they will always impose their own projects on us, and our external debt in particular will keep rising as a result of that.
Deputy Minister of Finance, Boahin, has actually stated that we are spending 3/4 of total national revenue plus grants on debt servicing and principal repayment. What does that mean in practical
in salaries?
terms?
In salaries.
Yeah.
In fact, the last figures I saw, after you've paid salaries and your debt servicing, which is principal and interest, it actually, I think it exceeded, because of the COVID crisis and the collapse of revenue, that one was over 100%.
The last figure I saw was 91%.
Yes, but okay, maybe things have since improved. But when you remember in the early stages of the crisis, there was a virtual collapse in revenue. And yet we had to meet our debt servicing obligations. Two things, that's why they are called statutory. Debt servicing and salaries. You have to pay them before everything else. So you go around cutting capital budgets and all that and so forth. And it's been a challenge, largely because the economy is not, two things. The economy is not growing as fast as it should. Don't forget, the government promised us double-digit growth. But then as of the last budget, they were actually moving from 8.1 to 4.6. Now that is now moving towards double-digit. You are moving away from double-digit. So the economy is not growing as much as it should. Plus, we're taking on debts. Remember, they would travel, go get $1 billion, $2 billion in Eurobond and come back. It was oversubscribed, which really made no sense, but it was good hype. So your debt levels are building up. Your economy is not growing as much as it should, and therefore your revenue is also not growing. You are definitely bound to have that big problem where after you pay your statutory obligations, you can no longer do that. That has been known long before they even came into office. The question is, how do you work with that? And one way of doing that is to put in place measures to grow your economy as quickly as well. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. You withheld payments to contractors, which also depressed the economy further. There's a whole range of reforms, and we put all these things in place. The wage bill, the last study I did, I looked at from 2013 to 2018. Every single year we exceeded the wage bill. That is bad planning and management. When you are exceeding your wage, it doesn't happen in other countries because you know exactly the number of people in your payroll, the number of people who would be coming up for promotion and therefore should be paid more. You know all that at the beginning of the year. But in the case of Ghana, we seem to ignore that. So every single year, including this year, so 2013 till now, all of them, every single year we exceed our wage bill. But we also fall short of our revenue. In that period, we only met our revenue targets 3 times. So you met your revenue targets 3 times, but for that period you exceeded, you are bound to have a problem. So we have a big problem with fiscal policy management, and this cuts across both NDC and MPP because the factors are structural. They even go back to Nkrumah's time. They are structural in terms of a heavy dependence on the public sector to create employment rather than creating the employment opportunities outside of that. And it has been with us. In the plan, we identified and analyzed all that and then proposed the various solutions for them to deal with it. Unfortunately, they're not interested. And so they're repeating the mistakes of the past. As I said, we remain prisoners of our past, really. Remain prisoners.
What are some of the solutions that you proposed?
Well, one of them is to have, as I mentioned that earlier, to have a third category of exports, which is the strategic exports that I talked about. That will help us deal with issues of exchange rate stability. Because if you're exporting high value products and services, you will have more than enough. Currently, the dollars, as it says, stay out there, so that then weakens the cedi consistently. We recommended that we take a new approach to fighting inflation. Currently, the whole responsibility is placed on the central bank. But the central bank only handles the monetary aspects of inflation. We have what we call the structural aspects that affects production. So if we deal with issues of infrastructure, transportation, the time it takes to move goods from, currently for Ghana, it's around 18 miles per hour for a cargo truck moving goods. In the best practice is 55 miles per hour. So these are some of the structural problems that we need to deal with for us to be able to have the productivity revolution to grow the economy. There's a whole range of other issues. Some are economic, some are institutional, some are social, and some, of course, I remember one of the proposals, which is number 5, is to also raise Ghana's position in the global economy as a way of both helping others and also helping ourselves.
In these circumstances, what do inflation rates really reflect?
Well, inflation rates, they reflect 2 things. They reflect the textbook definition that we all know, that it's too much money chasing 2 figures. That's the one aspect of it. But as I said, there are structural aspects of it, but those ones crawl slowly. So we don't usually, and that's why it needs to be a collaborative effort between the central bank and possibly the Ministry of Finance or NDPC. So the central bank will handle that textbook aspect, too much money, so you modulate that. But the structural part is what is beyond the central bank, but the Ministry of Finance and NDPC can handle that. So some of it, I mean, some of them are embedded in our systems. So I gave you the example of a cargo truck, for instance, moving on 18 months. It affects inflation, but most people do not realize that because it takes a much longer time. Why does a cargo truck in Ghana takes 18 miles per hour instead of 55? 1, it's overloaded from the port, so it's an institutional problem. 2, the nature of our roads, our curves. So it's embedded productivity issues. If they are not curves, they are hills. So there's a whole range of structural issues that we need. It's not until we address those, then the policies of the central bank will then become effective. more effective in terms of bringing down inflation. We should also give up this notion, well, inflation is single digit, but single digit where? If it's 7%, 8%, it's still very high. We need to bring it down to low single digit. Anything below 5% is what we should aim at. But it needs to be a collaborative effort between the monetary authorities and those who actually manage the economy. Currently, that relationship is not there. And so we constantly have high inflation. Where it has come down is largely because there's been a slowdown in the economy and therefore low demand and so forth and so on.
This administration, the Akufo-Addo administration, indicated that they had rebased the economy. What does that mean? Especially in relation to the figures they are churning out about inflation, about GDP, and so on.
Rebasing is basically means that they use the most recent information to calculate the GDP and inflation. The base is taken from what they call the base year. So the previous one, I believe, was 2010. That means that they use, in calculating inflation, they have what they call a basket of goods and services that you buy for 2010. Now we are in 2020. Clearly it has changed. Maybe people are spending more on mobile airtime than they are on food as a share. So you use that new information to calculate both your GDP and your inflation, and that's what they've done. When they did that, the inflation rate was lower and the GDP was also higher. In fact, GDP was said to have been about $12 billion more than what they thought it was. The problem with that approach is that there isn't really $12 billion sitting somewhere where you say, oh, we missed $12 billion, so we're going to get that and then tax them. It doesn't exist. It's more of an academic exercise. But then it creates the illusion that, oh, okay, if GDP is that low, then let's go and borrow more. And that's the problem it's always creating. Because when they do the rebasing, invariably it becomes bigger than it was. Then the ratio goes down, they go and borrow. But there's no economic activity to support that borrowing. Mm-hmm. And before you know it, you run into problems. It's not just Ghana. Nigeria also had the same problem around 2014, 2015 and other. Mm-hmm. So rebasing is okay, but you have to have a way to do what we call incremental changes in the methodology so that when the time comes for you to do rebasing, the gap will be very small. The Americans and other European countries actually also do rebasing, what they call comprehensive revisions. But the gap is not as big as we have here in Ghana and other parts, because they do the changes every year. But we ignore it for about 10 years, and then one day we get up and do it. And then the Ghana Statistical Service tells you, forget about what existed in the past, deal only with the year of rebasing. That means they're telling us to forget about our economic history. Mm. And it distorts that. So the most recent rebase was 2018 or thereabout, and then before that we had it in 2010. And it's distorted so many economic statistics that it then makes it very difficult for you to even make informed decisions. Again, we raised that in the long-term plan, that we should really do incremental changes in the calculation so that when the time comes for you to do rebasing, the gap, if any, will be very small and not as big and disruptive as we have now. The same applies to inflation. But inflation is easier to work your way backwards than with GDP. Yeah. Mm.
Well, viewers, we are talking to Dr. Nii Moi Thompson. We are talking to him about many things, development. We're talking to him about nation building and so on. We're going to go for our last commercial break, and when we come back, I'd like to ask him. He's read the manifestos of the two supposedly leading parties in Ghana. What do the manifestos say? Should we have hope in the future? Short break. Well, hello, welcome back to Talk Time, and we are talking to Dr. Nii Moi Thompson. Sir, have you read the manifestos of the two parties, National Democratic Congress and the New Patriotic Party?
I was actually part of the team. I wasn't part of the manifesto committee, but there was a separate economic advisory team for the NDC. I was part of it. And so I actually ended up writing certain parts of the NDC manifesto. So obviously I'm going to give it thumbs up for clarity and vision and so
But,
forth.
but first of all, is it true that you stole the MPP manifesto?
No, definitely not. I mean, come on. In the NDC manifesto, we talk, for instance, about Ujumapa. You don't see Ujumapa, in the MPP's manifesto, do you? No, that's definitely not it. We spent quite a bit of time in various places here in Accra, at Ridge, and Peduase, and so forth and so on. And the idea was to put job creation, and not just job creation, as I said, but good quality jobs at the center of economic policy. It's done all over the world. And so that's the major shift. And of course, it's not just previous governments have always talked about job creation, but in this case, there's going to be job creations along with the development of institutions to help us measure the performance of government when it says that we have created so and so jobs, just as we do with inflation now. Currently, it's not a government that gets out there and say, well, we've reduced, it's the Ghana Statistical Service. We want a situation where there will be an independent reporting of job creation in Ghana, and that's part of the NDC's manifesto. So, and that is, you won't find that in the MPP manifesto at all. There are proposals for reforming the financial and fiscal, the conduct of financial and fiscal policy to make it more proactive for economic growth, but also equity, because economic growth by itself will not bring national development. It could be so skewed that only few people would benefit and the rest of the society wouldn't do that. So all these things are reflected in the NDC's manifesto. The MPP manifesto, at least those parts that got to take a look at, were simply, more or less play on words as to what happened to debt. They're kind of caught in their own way, because you remember the noise they made about debt and this and that. Now that they find themselves overwhelmed with debt, they came up with all sorts of ratios. I just dismiss that as laughable. But I think we have a more credible alternative to what, based also on lessons of the past, that we have a much better alternative than they do, most definitely. So there's no way you could leave something good to go and steal something substandard. It's not possible. It's not possible at all. It's not possible.
There has been this talk about a debate between the two presidential candidates. What's your view? The MPP obviously is not happy about a debate.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that at least I saw the one from Imani, the government's response, the presidency's response to Imani's invitation to a debate. And they said they will be busy at that time. But Imani said, well, we haven't even given you a date yet. So, so how do you know when for you to be busy? So it's clear that they are in no mood for a debate. But the public is discerning enough to see what is going on. A debate is sometimes more political theater than substantive issues, even though this would have been a perfect platform for the two presidents to go at it. But in the absence of that, I think the public is smart enough to know whether or not the government has performed or not. Beyond free SHS, I don't think there's much of a record to defend. Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming to
too.
the studio.
Thank
we are
you.
most grateful to you.
Thank you.
For
I think
coming.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I've admired your Batakari throughout the whole program.
Well, viewers, we've been talking to Dr. Nii Moi Thompson. You heard it all. I am enlightened. I've been enlightened over the last hour. And I do hope that those of you at home will be able to pick a thing or two and to continue this conversation in your homes. This is the kind of conversation that affects every Ghanaian life. So please continue the conversations in your homes, in your offices, and so on. We are all looking for the best for Ghana. My final advice, please make sure that you don't shift your dial from Pan-African Television, because this is the station that brings you the best in news, best in current affairs, best in sports, best in entertainment, indeed, best in everything. Keep your dial on Pan-African Television until we meet again next week. It's goodbye from all of us here, especially our producer, the director of the show, Adam Lumo, and the producer of the show, George Yosson. Goodbye. We'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.